Sir Gareth never expected his hound to lead him to a dying maiden who would unravel everything he thought he knew about honor, guilt, and redemption. But as twilight bled through the skeletal branches of Thornwood Forest, Fenris suddenly veered from the well-worn path, hackles raised and nose twitching at secrets only he could scent. The knight, weathered by 35 winters and twice as many battles, didn't question his companion's instincts. Fenris had saved his life more times than prayer, and the great wolfhound's judgment ran truer than most men's. Gareth pulled gently on Ash's reins, guiding his destrier after the hound through brambles that caught at his travel-stained cloak. So, forest held its breath around them, no birdsong, no rustle of small creatures fleeing their approach. Even the wind seemed muted, as if the very air feared to disturb whatever lay ahead. Ash snorted uneasily, ears swiveling toward sounds Gareth couldn't hear. The horse's iron shoes rang against scattered stones, each step echoing too loudly in the unnatural quiet. 20 paces deeper into the undergrowth, Fenris stopped. The hound's low whine carried a note Gareth had heard only twice before, once over a dying child, once beside his fallen brother's body. The knight dismounted, hand instinctively checking the weight of his sword, though no earthly enemy would require steel here. She lay crumpled against the base of an ancient oak, pale as morning frost. Her gown, once fine silk the color of winter sky, now hung in tatters stained dark with blood and forest mold. Golden hair spilled across her face like spun sunlight, matted with leaves and worse things. Her breathing came so shallow that Gareth had to kneel close to see the faint flutter at her throat. Not dead, not yet. He'd seen enough battlefield casualties to know death's approach, but this was different. No weapon had felled her, at least none he could identify. Her injuries spoke of flight, of desperate running through thorns and over stones, until her body simply surrendered. Her feet were raw and bleeding through shredded silk slippers, never meant for such travail. Gareth stripped off his heavy cloak and wrapped it around her carefully, noting the quality of her torn garments, the delicate gold chain at her throat, bearing some pendant now hidden beneath fabric. Noble born, certainly, but what had driven a lady of gentle breeding to die alone in these dark woods? As he lifted her, she weighed no more than a shadow. Her head lolled against his shoulder, and he caught the faintest whisper of words. A name, perhaps, or a prayer too broken to understand. Fenris padded ahead, leading them back toward the path and the distant warmth of home. Behind them, the forest settled into deeper darkness, keeping its secrets. But Gareth carried one of those secrets now, breathing soft and fragile in his arms, and he wondered if saving her would prove to be his salvation or his doom. The Great. All of Gareth's keep had seen grander days, but the small chamber beside the hearth remained untouched by time's decay. Here, in the warmest corner of his modest domain, he laid the maiden on a narrow bed that old Marta had prepared with swift, practiced efficiency. "Fever's taken hold," Marta murmured, pressing her weathered palm against the girl's forehead. The housekeeper had tended wounds since before Gareth drew his first breath, and her gnarled fingers moved with gentle authority as she peeled away the ruined silk. "Been running wild for days, I'd wager. Look at these feet." Gareth turned his back while Marta worked, staring into the fire that cast dancing shadows across stone walls. The maiden's belongings lay scattered on the wooden table. Precious little to tell her story. A torn letter, its seal broken and ink smeared beyond reading. A gold pendant, its chain snapped, bearing a crest he didn't recognize, but somehow stirred unease in his chest. "She's nobility, certain enough," Marta said, wrapping the girl's ravaged feet in clean linen. "This cloth cost more than most see. In a year. But what drove her to run barefoot through Thornwood?" The question hung between them like smoke. Gareth had known desperate flight himself, the wild escape from enemies, the burning need to put distance between oneself and some terrible truth. But ladies of gentle birth didn't typically flee alone into the wilderness unless something had shattered their world entirely. "Will she live?" he asked. Marta's silence stretched long enough to tighten his jaw. Finally, she sighed. "Perhaps, if the fever breaks by dawn, if her body remembers how to fight." She gathered the bloodied rags, pausing at the door. "I'll prepare broth. Keep the fire fed, but don't let it blaze too high. Gentle heat, like tending a wounded bird." Alone with the stranger, Gareth settled into the wooden chair beside the bed. The maiden's face, cleaned of forest grime, revealed delicate features shadowed by exhaustion. Dark circles ringed her closed eyes, and her lips, cracked from thirst and cold, moved occasionally with soundless words. He lifted the damaged pendant, studying the worn silver crest in the firelight. 3 ravens on a field of azure, unfamiliar, yet it tugged at memories he couldn't quite grasp. The torn letter offered no better clues, its elegant script reduced to fragments of phrases. "Cannot honor, and must flee before." A soft moan drew his attention back to her face. Her brow furrowed, as if troubled by dreams, and one pale hand clutched at the blanket with desperate strength. "Easy," Gareth said quietly, the same tone he used with wounded horses. "You're safe now." Her grip relaxed slightly, though she didn't wake, but something in her breathing changed, as if his voice had reached whatever dark place her mind wandered. Outside, wind rattled the shutters. Inside, the fire crackled softly, and Gareth began his vigil. Dawn crept through the chamber's single window like a hesitant visitor, casting pale light across the maiden's face. Gareth had dozed fitfully in the wooden chair, jerking awake each time her breathing changed or the fire needed tending. Now, as morning touched her features, her eyelids fluttered. She woke like a startled deer, eyes snapping open, body tensing beneath the blankets as if preparing to bolt. Her gaze darted wildly around the unfamiliar chamber before settling on Gareth's weathered face. Fear flickered there, sharp and immediate. "Peace," he said softly, remaining perfectly still in his chair. "You're safe." She studied him with eyes, the color of storm clouds, taking in his rumpled clothes, the sword belt hanging on the wall, the rough-hewn stones surrounding them. Her voice, when it came, was barely more than a whisper. "Where am I?" "My keep. You were dying in Thornwood Forest." "My hound found you." Memory seemed to return in fragments. Her hand moved instinctively to her throat, fingers searching for something that wasn't there. The pendant. Gareth had placed it on the table, but her eyes hadn't yet found it among her scattered belongings. "How long?" she asked. "3 days. The fever nearly took you." She tried to sit up, then gasped and fell back against the pillow. Her face had gone white as morning frost, and Gareth could see the effort it cost her to maintain even this simple conversation. "My name is Gareth," he offered, hoping to ease the wariness in her expression. "This is my home, small but secure." She watched him for a long moment, as if weighing his words against some inner measure of trust. When she spoke again, her voice carried the careful politeness of noble breeding, even weakened as it was. "I am Elena." The slight pause before the name didn't escape his notice, but he gave no sign of it. "I thank you for your kindness, Sir Gareth. I fear I have imposed upon your hospitality." "No imposition. You needed help. Still, I should not—" She shifted uncomfortably, wincing. "I should not remain here. It isn't proper." "Proper doesn't matter when you can barely lift your head." His tone remained gentle, but firm. "You'll rest until you're strong enough to travel safely." Something in her expression suggested she wanted to argue, but her body betrayed her. This brief exchange had exhausted her reserves, and her eyelids grew heavy despite her obvious desire to stay alert. "The letter," she said suddenly, struggling against sleep. "My belongings—" "Safe," Gareth assured her. "Everything's here. She nodded slightly, then surrendered to fatigue, but as sleep claimed her again, Gareth noticed how her fingers twisted in the blanket and how her breathing remained shallow with tension even in unconsciousness. Elena. The name felt wrong in his mind, like an ill-fitting glove. Whatever her true identity, she guarded it as carefully as she guarded the fear that still lingered in her storm-grey eyes. The study felt smaller than usual in the candlelight, its walls pressing close as Gareth spread Elena's belongings across. The scarred oak table, the torn letter lay beside the broken pendant, both items seeming to whisper secrets he wasn't certain he wanted to hear. He'd waited until she slept soundly, until Marta's snores echoed from the kitchen, before retreating. Here with the stranger's possessions, something about the pendant had nagged at him since that first night, a familiarity that danced just beyond memory's reach. Now, holding it properly in the steady flame, he could see the crest clearly. 3 ravens, wings spread in flight, etched into silver that had once gleamed bright as winter stars. Below them, a motto in Latin script so fine it was barely legible, "Death before dishonor." The candle flame wavered as his hand began to tremble. Raven Crest. The name hit him like a mailed fist to the chest, dragging with it memories he'd spent 5 years trying to bury. Rain-soaked fields outside Ashford, the clash of steel, the weight of his sword as it found its mark between the plates, of ornate armor, the way Lord Edmund Ravencrest had looked at him in that final moment, not with hatred, but with something far worse. Understanding. "Christ's blood," Gareth whispered, setting the pendant down as if it burned. Lady Isabel Ravencrest. The daughter who had vanished after her father's death, fled rather than accept the arranged marriage that would have sealed her family's submission to the crown. Every knight in 3 counties had searched for her, but she'd disappeared like morning mist, and he'd brought her into his home, fed her, tended her wounds, sat vigil beside her bed while she fought for life. The irony tasted bitter as wormwood. Edmund Ravencrest had died by Gareth's blade in service to a king's justice, branded traitor for supporting the old claim. But the man Gareth had killed that day hadn't looked like a rebel, just a father defending what remained of his honor. Gareth picked up the torn letter with careful fingers, trying to piece together the remaining fragments. "Cannot honor the betrothal and flee before they come." The words painted a picture of desperation, of a young woman choosing exile over submission. She didn't know. How could she? She'd been barely 16 when her father fell, probably kept far from the political machinations that had destroyed her house. To her, he was simply the knight who'd saved her life. But the pendant told a different truth. She was the daughter of the man whose death still haunted Gareth's dreams, whose last words had been not a curse, but a plea. "Protect my child." Outside, wind moaned through the keep's stone corridors. The candle guttered, casting wild shadows across the crest that had condemned a family and now threatened to destroy the fragile peace Gareth had built in exile. In the chamber beyond, Eleanor slept on, unaware that her savior was also her father's killer. Recovery came slowly, like frost melting under gentle sun. By the end of her first week, Elena could sit by the window without her hands shaking, and by the second, she insisted on helping Marta with simple tasks, despite Gareth's protests. He watched her move through his modest keep with careful grace, noting how she folded linens with precise corners, how she stirred the porridge with steady rhythm, how she paused sometimes to study the worn tapestries as if reading stories in their faded threads. Everything about her spoke of noble breeding, yet she never complained about the rough fare or humble accommodations. "You needn't work," he said one morning, finding her in the small garden behind the kitchen. She knelt among the late autumn herbs, gathering what remained of Marta's rosemary and thyme. "I need to be useful." She didn't look up from her task, Idle hands breed troubled thoughts. Gareth couldn't argue with that truth. His own hands had learned the same lesson during the dark months after Ashford, when sleep brought only blood-soaked dreams. They settled into routines that felt both natural and dangerous. She would join him for the morning meal, sharing bread and small conversation about the weather, the approaching winter, the way Fenris had taken to following her through the corridors. Nothing deeper, nothing that touched the careful walls they'd both constructed around their pasts. In the afternoons, while Gareth saw to his modest holdings, Elena would sit by the hearth with mending. Her stitches were neat and sure, turning torn cloth into something whole again. Sometimes he would find her humming softly as she worked, melodies he didn't recognize but that seemed to ease something tight in his chest. "Where did you learn to sing?" he asked one evening, her hands stilled on the fabric. My aunt taught me. She said music helped heal the heart." Another careful half-truth, he suspected, but he didn't press. They were both dancing around deeper waters, content for now to wade in shallows. The most dangerous moments came in the silences. When she would look up from her sewing to find him watching her, something unguarded flickering in her storm-grey eyes, when their fingers would brush as she handed him his cup of ale, and neither would pull away immediately. When she would catch him staring into the fire, with that haunted expression he thought he'd hidden, and her voice would grow soft with understanding. "Bad dreams?" she asked one night. "Old ones," he replied. She nodded as if she knew exactly what he meant. They fade in time. He wanted to believe her. Wanted to believe that the weight of Edmund Ravencrest's death might someday lift from his shoulders. But sitting across from the man's daughter, watching firelight paint gold in her hair, Gareth felt the burden growing heavier with each passing day. Because somewhere between tending her fever and sharing quiet meals, he'd begun to care for her. And that made everything infinitely worse. Eleanor found the letter while searching for thread in Gareth's chamber. He'd given her permission to use his table for mending, and she'd been looking through the small wooden box where Marta kept her sewing supplies when her fingers brushed against something that didn't belong. The parchment was stiff with dried water damage, its edges brown and brittle. Her breath caught as she recognized her own careful script, now barely legible beneath the stains. "You kept it," she said when Gareth entered with an armload of firewood. He paused, seeing what she held. "I thought, perhaps when you were stronger, you might want it back." Elena carried the letter to the window, though the fading daylight offered little help. Most of the ink had run or faded entirely, leaving only fragments of words floating like islands in a sea of brown stains. "I can barely read it now," she whispered, tracing the damaged lines with one finger. "It was the last thing I wrote before I ran." Gareth set down the wood and moved closer, drawn despite himself. What did it say? She was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of old grief. It was to my betrothed, Sir Marcus Blackwood. The name came out like something distasteful. I was trying to explain why I couldn't honor our arrangement, why I had to choose exile over submission. Gareth's chest tightened. He'd heard of Blackwood, a man known more for his landholdings than his honor. He was not kind. He was not cruel exactly, just empty, like speaking to a suit of armor with no one inside. She held the letter up to catch the last light. "I wrote that I would rather live as a peasant than die as his chattel, that some cages are too small for the soul, no matter how gilded." The words hung between them, carrying more truth than any Elena had yet spoken. "You think me foolish," she said, not meeting his eyes. "No." The answer came quickly, surprising them both with its vehemence. "I think you brave." She looked at him then, something shifting in her expression. "You speak as one who knows about cages." Gareth stared into the dying fire, remembering different battles, different choices. "I served a king once, did things in his name that I thought were righteous." His voice grew rough. "Learned too late that sometimes the orders we follow lead us places our souls can't return from. Is that why you live alone here? Penance? Perhaps. Or perhaps just cowardice. Elena set the ruined letter on the table with careful reverence. Not cowardice, I think you're healing, like this place. She gestured around the simple chamber. Everything here feels intentional, peaceful. And what of you? Will you heal as well? She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. I'm learning that some wounds leave scars that change us. The trick is deciding whether they make us stronger or just more careful. Outside, full darkness had fallen, and the first snow of winter began to tap against the shutters like fingers seeking entry. The merchant arrived with the first real snow, his wagon wheels crunching through the courtyard's white blanket like bones breaking. Gareth had been expecting him. Brother Thomas made this route twice yearly, trading simple goods and carrying news between the scattered holdings. Elena insisted on helping unload the supplies despite Gareth's protests. She moved carefully in, the cold, her breath forming small clouds as she carried sacks of grain into the storehouse. The merchant, a weathered man with kind eyes, watched her work with the appreciation of someone who recognized quality when he saw it. "Your lady wife is a blessing, Sir Gareth," Thomas said, accepting a cup of mulled wine in the keep's main hall. "Not many nobles would soil their hands with such work." "She's not my wife," Gareth replied quickly, then felt heat rise in his face. At Elena's sharp glance, Thomas chuckled. "Forgive an old man's assumptions. She carries herself like nobility, though. Reminds me of someone." He stroked his greying beard thoughtfully. "Ah, yes. Poor Lady Isabel Ravencrest. Same grace, same bearing." The cup slipped from Gareth's fingers, clattering against the stone floor. Wine spread like blood across the grey stones. "What of Lady Isabel?" Eleanor asked, her voice carefully neutral, but Gareth caught the tension beneath it. "Still missing. God preserve her soul. Been near 6 months now since she vanished from her guardian's estate." Thomas shook his head sadly. "Sir Marcus Blackwood's beside himself, they say. Had the wedding planned and everything. Some whisper she's dead, but I pray not. Too much tragedy in that family already." Gareth felt the world tilting around him. 6 months. The timing matched perfectly with Elena's arrival, with her desperate flight through Thornwood. He forced his voice to remain steady. "Her father, Lord Edmund, he died at Ashford. Aye, poor soul, cut down in that wretched business." Thomas crossed himself. "They say he died honourably at least. Faced his end like a true knight, defending what he believed right, even if the Crown named it treason." Elena had gone very still beside the hearth, her face pale as the snow outside. She stared into the fire as if seeking answers in the flames. "And the daughter simply vanished?" Gareth pressed, though each word felt like swallowing glass, like morning mist. "Left behind a letter breaking her betrothal, then disappeared entirely. Some say she threw herself from the cliffs in grief. Others believe she fled to distant relatives." Thomas leaned forward conspiratorially. "Though between us, I hope she found sanctuary somewhere." Marriage to Blackwood would have been its own kind of death. The fire crackled in the sudden silence. Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she reached for her wine cup, and Gareth saw her struggle to maintain composure. Lady Isabel Ravencrest, not Elena, the daughter of the man he'd killed, sitting in his hall, sharing his hearth, warming something in his chest he'd thought long dead. The irony was as sharp as any blade he'd ever faced. That night, Gareth sat alone in his study while the wind howled outside like the voices of the dead. Brother Thomas had departed before the storm worsened, carrying his news to other lonely keeps. Elena had retired early, claiming exhaustion, though Gareth suspected she needed solitude to process what she'd heard. Lady Isabel Ravencrest. The name echoed in his mind like a funeral bell, dragging him back 5 years to rain-soaked fields and the clash of steel. He closed his eyes and let the memory take him. Ashford. The rebels had made their stand on a low hill, banners snapping in. The autumn wind. Lord Edmund Ravencrest rode at their centre, his armour gleaming despite the grey sky, the 3 ravens of his house proud on his surcoat. He'd been magnificent that day, every inch the noble knight, fighting for what he believed was right. Gareth had been younger then, still believing in the righteousness of royal commands. When King Henry ordered the rebel lords brought to heel, Gareth had ridden eagerly to war, convinced he served justice. The battle had been brief but brutal. The king's forces outnumbered the rebels 3-1, and what began as warfare quickly became slaughter. Gareth found himself facing Lord Edmund in the melee, their horses dancing around each other as steel rang against steel. Edmund had been skilled, but age and grief had slowed him. His wife had died the previous winter, leaving him alone with a young daughter to protect. As their swords locked, Gareth had seen something break in the older man's eyes, not fear, but terrible understanding. "My daughter," Edmund had whispered in that final moment, blood frothing on his lips. "She's only 16. Protect her. Promise." "Me." Gareth had knelt beside the dying man, rain washing the blood from Edmund's face. The promise had come naturally, though he'd known even then it was likely worthless. "I swear it, my lord." Now sitting in his study with that same daughter sleeping under his roof, the oath felt like mockery. He'd killed her father and then saved her life, destroyed her family and given her shelter. The cruel irony made his hands shake as he poured. Another cup of wine. She didn't know. How could she? In those chaotic final moments at Ashford, surrounded by dying men and screaming horses, she couldn't have seen his face among the king's knights. To her, he was simply Gareth, the man who'd found her dying in the forest. But he knew, every time she smiled at him, every moment of growing trust between them felt like a betrayal of both their souls. He was falling in love with the daughter of the man whose death haunted his dreams, and she was finding peace with her father's killer. Outside, Elena's window showed a faint glow where she'd lit a candle. Perhaps she couldn't sleep either, wrestling with her own ghosts. Gareth stared at the pendant on his table, its 3 ravens seeming to watch him with accusing eyes. Soon, very soon, the truth would demand its reckoning. Fenris sensed them first, as he always did. The wolfhound's hackles rose 3 hours before the riders appeared on the horizon, his low growl rumbling through the keep like distant thunder. Gareth found him at the main gate, nose lifted to catch scents that spoke of approaching danger. "How many?" Gareth asked, though he knew the hound couldn't answer. Fenris's posture told him enough. Tense, alert, but not the rigid terror that marked true enemies. These riders came with purpose, not war. They crested the hill as the afternoon sun slanted low through winter clouds. 6 men in mail, their horses breathing steam in the cold air. At their head rode a knight Gareth recognized from court tournaments. Sir Marcus Blackwood, his black surcoat bearing the silver wolf of his house, handsome in the way of men who'd never known true hardship, with golden hair and a jaw that spoke of noble breeding and abundant meals. Elena appeared at Gareth's shoulder as the riders approached. She'd gone pale at the sight of them, her fingers clutching at her shawl with white-knuckled tension. "Stay inside," Gareth murmured, but she shook her head. "He'll see me eventually. Better to face it now, on my terms." Marcus dismounted with theatrical flourish, removing his helm to reveal features that belonged on cathedral statuary. His smile was warm as summer sunshine and twice as false. "Sir Gareth of Thornridge," he called, his voice carrying the polished confidence of wealth and position. "I come seeking what was stolen from me." "Nothing here belongs to you, Blackwood." Marcus's gaze shifted to Elena, and his expression softened into something meant to resemble tenderness. "Isabel, my dear heart, you've led us quite a chase." "My name is Elena," she said quietly, but her voice carried clearly across the courtyard. Come. Now, sweet child, there's no need for games. Marcus stepped closer, ignoring Gareth entirely. I know you've been frightened, confused by grief, but you're safe now. I've come to take you home. I am home. The words hung in the cold air like a challenge. Marcus's smile flickered, and for a moment, Gareth glimpsed something harder beneath the polished surface. You're overwrought. Understandable given your ordeal. Marcus gestured toward his men. But your guardian has been beside himself with worry. The wedding preparations are nearly complete. Our guests await us. I wrote you a letter, Elena said, her voice growing stronger. I was very clear about my intentions. A temporary madness brought on by grief. Nothing that cannot be mended. Marcus reached for her hand, but she stepped back, placing herself closer to Gareth's side. The gesture wasn't lost on Marcus. His eyes narrowed as he finally gave Gareth his full attention, taking in the scarred hands, the plain clothes, the modest keep that spoke of reduced circumstances. I see, Marcus said softly. Someone has been filling your head with foolish notions, my dear, but we'll sort that out soon enough. The threat was velvet-wrapped but unmistakable. The main hall felt smaller, with Marcus's presence filling it like smoke. He'd dismissed his men to wait outside, but the threat lingered in every gesture, every calculated smile. Eleanor stood near, the hearth, her back straight despite the tremor in her hands. Enough of this charade, Marcus said, his patience finally fraying. Isabel, you will come with me tonight. Your reputation has suffered enough damage living unchaperoned with this hermit. I won't. Her voice was steady as stone. I told you in my letter. Your letter was the ravings of a grief-mad child. Marcus's mask slipped entirely, revealing the cold authority beneath. You think I don't know what happened at Ashford? Your father died a traitor's death, branded rebel against the crown. You have no family left, no protection save what I offer. Elena flinched as if struck. Gareth stepped forward, but Marcus wasn't finished. And you, he said, turning his venom on Gareth. Did you think I wouldn't discover your part in it? Sir Gareth of Thornridge, who rode with the king's forces at Ashford, who helped put down the rebellion. The words hit Elena like physical blows. She turned to Gareth, her storm-grey eyes wide with dawning horror. You were there, she whispered. Gareth's throat felt lined with ash. Isabel, Elena, she corrected automatically, but her voice had gone hollow. Marcus laughed, the sound sharp as breaking glass. Oh, this is rich. You didn't tell her, did you? Didn't mention that you were among the knights who slaughtered her father's men? Stop. Gareth's hand moved instinctively toward his sword. Which one were you, I wonder? One of the cowards who struck from behind? Or perhaps... Marcus's eyes glittered with malicious understanding. No, you were the one, weren't you? The one who faced Edmund Ravencrest himself. Elena staggered, as if the hall had tilted beneath her feet. You killed him. You killed my father. The accusation hung in the air like a blade. Gareth wanted to explain, to tell her about Edmund's final words, the promise he'd made, the years of guilt that had driven him to this exile. But what explanation could possibly matter now? Yes, he said simply. I killed him. She closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, they held the emptiness of someone whose world had just shattered a second time. Marcus moved closer to her, his voice gentle now, as if comforting a wounded animal. You see, my dear, this is what comes of trusting strangers. Come home with me. Let me protect you as I should have from the beginning. Elena looked between them, the man who had killed her father and the man who would cage her soul. Two different kinds of death, dressed in honor and comfort. I need time, she whispered. Time is a luxury you can't afford, Marcus replied. Choose now, Isabel, the past or the future, honor or shame. But Gareth saw something in her expression that Marcus missed. Not the resignation of defeat, but the stillness that comes before. A storm breaks. Dawn came pale and cold, painting the courtyard stones with frost that crunched beneath their feet. Elena had spent the night in vigil by the dying fire, and when she emerged from the keep, her face bore the stillness of someone who had wrestled with angels and emerged changed. Marcus waited beside his horse, confident in his victory. His men sat their mounts with the patience of those who knew. The outcome was never in doubt. After all, what choice did a penniless orphan really have? Gareth stood apart, close enough to intervene if needed, but far enough to give her space. He'd said nothing since her world shattered the night before, understanding that some choices could only be made in solitude. "Have you come to your senses, my dear?" Marcus asked, his voice gentle now that he believed he'd won. Elena walked to the center of the courtyard, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. She wore the simple wool dress Marta had given her, but she carried herself like the noble lady she'd been born to be. "I have thought much about choices," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the still morning. "About honor and duty and the weight of the past." Marcus smiled, reaching for her hand. "Then you'll come home with me?" "No." The word was soft but absolute. "I will not." His confidence faltered. "Isabel, be reasonable. You have nowhere else." "My name is Elena." She pulled back from his reaching fingers. "Isabel Ravencrest died the same night her father did. I am someone else now." "This is madness," Marcus snarled, his composure finally cracking. "You think to stay here with him, the man who murdered your father?" Eleanor turned to look at Gareth then, and he saw something in her eyes he hadn't expected. Not forgiveness, not yet, but understanding. "My father died fighting for what he believed was right," she said quietly, "and this man has spent 5 years paying the price for doing his duty. We have both been prisoners of that day." She paused, drawing a shaky breath. "I choose to stop being a prisoner." Marcus's face darkened with fury. "You'll regret this, girl. Both of you. I'll see that neither of you knows peace." "Perhaps," Elena replied, "but I would rather face an uncertain future than accept a certain cage." Marcus mounted his horse with violent efficiency, his men falling in behind him as they rode toward the gate. He called back one final threat. "This isn't finished." But Elena had already turned away, walking back toward the keep where Fenris waited by the door, tail wagging low. She paused beside Gareth, not touching him, but close enough that he could feel her warmth in the cold air. "I don't forgive you," she said softly. "Not yet. But I understand why you couldn't tell me. And I understand that we are both more than the worst thing we've ever done." It wasn't absolution, but it was a beginning. Spring came softly to Thornridge, as if the very earth had learned patience. 2 years had passed since Marcus Blackwood rode away in fury, and the keep had changed in ways both subtle and profound. New tapestries hung in the hall, woven by Elena's skilled hands with threads dyed from Marta's garden herbs. The solar had been expanded, its windows facing east to catch the morning light that Elena loved for her reading. She no longer called herself Elena. "Lady Gareth sounds wrong," she'd said one evening as they planned their quiet wedding. "And Isabel belongs to someone I used to be, so she'd simply become wife, as he'd become husband, and the names mattered less than the peace they'd built between them." The villagers had accepted her easily enough. She brought her father's gift for healing, setting bones, tending fevers, delivering babies with hands that remembered gentleness despite all they'd endured. They called her simply "my lady," and brought their troubles to her kitchen table, where she listened with the same attention she once gave to broken letters. Gareth watched her now from the doorway as she examined young Tom Fletcher's arm. The boy had fallen from an apple tree, and his mother had brought him straight to the keep rather than the village-wise woman. "It's not broken," she told the anxious mother, "but you'll want to bind it for a few days. And perhaps Tom could help." Me with lighter tasks while it heals. My garden needs weeding. The boy's face brightened at the prospect of earning coin, and his mother's relief was palpable. They left with a jar of Marta's salve and strict instructions about rest. Tom already planning what he'd buy with his wages. "You spoil them," Gareth said when they were alone. "They remind me that I'm useful." She wiped her hands clean, then reached for the letter that had arrived that morning. Brother Thomas brought news. Gareth tensed. News from the outside world rarely brought comfort. "Marcus has married," she continued, her voice carefully neutral. "A merchant's daughter from York. Very profitable, apparently." "Are you relieved?" she said simply. "He has what he always wanted, wealth and position. Perhaps now he'll leave us in peace." She didn't mention the other news Thomas had carried, whispers that King Henry grew ill, that his heir showed little interest in pursuing old grudges. Sometimes the world simply moved on, leaving yesterday's tragedies to gather dust like unused armor. That evening, as they sat by the fire with Fenris snoring at their feet, she reached for Gareth's hand. His fingers were stained with ink from the accounts he'd been updating, hers rough from the day's work. "I've been thinking," she said quietly. "Dangerous habit," she smiled. "About names, about new beginnings." Her free hand moved to rest against her stomach, and Gareth's breath caught as understanding dawned. "Are you certain? As certain as spring follows winter?" Outside, the first stars appeared, and somewhere in the darkness, new life stirred beneath their roof.